Most people believe poverty is about money. They believe the difference between the rich and the poor is simply opportunity, education, or luck. But psychology tells a different story, because the real prison of poverty is not financial, it's mental. Across the world, millions of people work harder every year, yet remain trapped in the same cycle. Same stress, same struggles, same results. And the reason isn't always what people think. Because hidden beneath economic systems, there are powerful psychological patterns that quietly shape behavior, decision-making, and long-term outcomes. Patterns that make escaping poverty incredibly difficult. Not because people are incapable, but because the system of thought they live inside was designed to keep them where they are. In this video, we'll break down 5 psychological forces that explain why most people never escape poverty. And once you see them, you'll start noticing them everywhere. 1. The survival mindset trap. Imagine waking up every day knowing that one unexpected bill could destroy your entire month. The rent is due. Groceries are expensive. The car needs repairs. And the paycheck you worked for already has a destination before it even arrives. For millions of people around the world, this isn't a temporary situation. It's a permanent reality. And over time, living under constant financial pressure begins to do something profound to the human brain. Because poverty doesn't just affect your bank account, it affects how you think. Psychologists call this phenomenon the scarcity mindset. When resources become limited, the brain shifts into a completely different mode of operation. A survival mode. In this mode, the brain becomes hyper-focused on immediate problems. How do I pay the bill today? How do I fix this emergency? How do I survive the next week? Every ounce of mental energy becomes directed toward solving the present moment. And while that may sound logical, it comes with a hidden cost. Because when the brain is trapped in survival mode, it loses the ability to think long-term. Planning 5 years ahead feels irrelevant when you're struggling to make it through the next 5 days. Saving money feels impossible when every dollar already has a purpose. Investing feels risky when failure could mean losing everything. The mind becomes trapped in what researchers call tunnel vision, a psychological narrowing of attention that blocks out anything that isn't immediately urgent. And the danger of tunnel vision is simple. You can only see what's directly in front of you, not the path that leads out. In one famous study, researchers found that financial stress reduces cognitive capacity in a way similar to losing several hours of sleep. In other words, poverty doesn't just limit opportunity. It temporarily limits mental bandwidth. The brain becomes overloaded. Decision-making becomes harder. Impulses become stronger. Long-term planning becomes weaker, which creates a dangerous cycle. Because when people are forced to constantly solve short-term problems, they rarely have the mental space to build long-term solutions. It's like trying to design an escape plan while the building is already on fire. Every thought is focused on putting out the flames, not redesigning the structure. And this is one of the most misunderstood aspects of poverty. Many people assume that those who struggle financially simply need better discipline or better decisions. But psychology suggests something more complex. When the brain is under chronic stress, its priority shifts. It stops optimizing for the future and starts optimizing for survival, which is why someone might take a high-interest loan just to get through the week, or spend money impulsively for a brief moment of relief, or avoid thinking about the future entirely because the present already feels overwhelming. These behaviors may seem irrational from the outside, but inside a survival mindset, they feel completely logical. Because survival mode doesn't ask, what will make me wealthy in 10 years? It asks, what will get me through today? And when people live in this state long enough, something subtle begins to happen. Survival stops feeling temporary. It starts feeling permanent. The brain adapts. Expectations shrink. Ambitions fade. Not because people lose their intelligence, but because their mental energy has been consumed by the constant pressure of staying afloat. And the tragedy of the survival mindset is that it becomes self-reinforcing. The more someone focuses on short-term survival, the less time and energy they have to create long-term change. which slowly locks them into the same financial patterns year after year. But understanding this psychological trap reveals something important. Escaping poverty is not just about earning more money. It's about escaping survival mode. Because only when the brain has the space to breathe can it begin to imagine a different future. And for many people, that first moment of mental breathing room is where the real journey out of poverty begins. 2. The environment effect. Human beings like to believe they are independent thinkers, that their decisions are entirely their own. But psychology tells a very different story, because much of what we believe, what we expect, and even what we consider possible, is quietly shaped by the environment around us. From the moment we are born, we begin absorbing patterns. How people talk about money, how they respond to opportunity, how they react to risk. These patterns slowly become our internal blueprint for how life works. And most of the time, we don't even realize it. Imagine two children growing up in two completely different environments. In one home, dinner conversations revolve around investments, entrepreneurship, and future planning. Parents discuss business ideas. They talk about assets, ownership, and long-term growth. Failure is treated as a learning experience. Risk is considered part of the journey. For that child, wealth building isn't mysterious. It's normal. Now imagine another home. The conversations sound very different. Money is always stressful. Bills are constantly discussed. Debt feels overwhelming. Risk is something to avoid. Security is the ultimate goal. The message, repeated over and over, is simple. Work hard. Keep your head down. Don't take chances. And slowly, these messages sink deep into the child's mind. Because the human brain is designed to learn through social modeling. Psychologists call this social proof. We naturally copy the behaviors we see around us. If everyone in your environment works traditional jobs, that becomes the expected path. If nobody talks about investing, investing feels unfamiliar. If no one starts businesses, entrepreneurship seems unrealistic. The brain interprets these patterns as signals about what is normal and what is not. Over time, these signals form invisible boundaries. Boundaries that define what feels possible. And here's the surprising part. These boundaries are rarely based on actual ability. They are based on exposure. Because people tend to imagine futures that resemble the environments they know. If someone has never seen wealth building up close, can feel like something distant, something reserved for other people, other places, other worlds. But environment shapes more than beliefs. It also shapes opportunity. People tend to form relationships with those around them, which means networks often form within the same financial environments. If your social circle struggles financially, most of the opportunities you encounter will likely come from people in similar situations. But if your environment includes entrepreneurs, investors, or creators, new opportunities appear naturally through conversation. Ideas spread, skills circulate, partnerships form. In other words, environment quietly influences the flow of opportunity. This is why psychologists and economists often say something powerful. Your income is often strongly correlated with the average income of the people you spend the most time with. Not because wealth transfers directly, but because behaviors do, habits do, mindsets do. If everyone around you saves money, saving becomes normal. If everyone around you learns new skills, learning becomes normal. If everyone around you talks about growth, growth becomes normal. Environment acts like gravity. It pulls behavior in a certain direction, and resisting that pull requires enormous awareness and effort, which explains why escaping poverty is often more than an individual challenge. It's an environmental one, because when someone attempts to think differently than the people around them, they often face subtle resistance. Friends may question their choices. Family may discourage risk, not out of malice, but out of fear. Fear of the unknown, fear of change, and fear that stepping outside the familiar might lead to failure. So many people quietly adjust their ambitions to fit their environment. They lower expectations, avoid standing out, and slowly return to the path everyone else is walking. But understanding the environment effect reveals something powerful. Because while environment can shape behavior, can also be changed. Exposure to new ideas, new communities, new mentors, new ways of thinking. These experiences can expand what the brain considers possible. Suddenly, paths that once felt unrealistic begin to feel attainable. And once the mind accepts a new possibility, behavior begins to change, which means the environment someone chooses to enter can quietly transform the direction of their entire life. Because sometimes the first step toward escaping poverty is simply stepping into a different room. 3. The financial knowledge gap. For most people, the path to success seems simple. Study hard, get good grades, find a stable job, work consistently, and eventually, life should improve. This formula has been repeated for generations. And for many people, it does lead to stability. But stability is not the same as financial freedom. And here lies one of the most overlooked reasons why so many people remain financially stuck. Because while schools teach many things, they rarely teach how money actually works. From childhood to adulthood, students spend thousands of hours learning mathematics, science, literature, and history, but almost no time learning about how wealth grows, how investments compound, how assets generate income, or how financial systems truly operate. As a result, millions of people enter adulthood highly educated, but financially unprepared. They know how to solve complex equations, but they don't know how compound interest can multiply wealth over time. They know how to write essays, but they don't understand the difference between an asset and a liability. And without realizing it, most people adopt a financial model that looks like this. Work for money, spend money, repeat. This structure creates what economists call the income treadmill. The idea that life becomes a continuous cycle of earning and spending with very little long-term wealth accumulation. At first, this system appears functional. Paycheck arrives, bills are paid, life continues. But over time, something subtle begins to happen. Expenses grow, responsibilities increase, lifestyle expectations rise, and suddenly even higher income doesn't necessarily lead to financial progress. Because the system itself hasn't changed. Money still depends entirely on time. If the person stops working, the income stops too. But wealthy individuals often operate within a completely different system. Instead of focusing only on income from labor, they focus on assets. Assets that generate income even when they are not actively working. Investments, businesses, real estate, ownership structures that allow money to continue flowing without constant effort. And this difference creates a powerful gap. Because once assets begin generating income, time and money become partially disconnected, which allows wealth to grow faster than effort alone would allow. But for many people, this entire concept remains invisible. Not because it's secret, but because it was never part of their education. And when people don't understand how wealth systems work, they naturally default to what they do understand. Working harder, working longer, chasing higher salaries. But even this approach has limits. There are only so many hours in a day. And even the most hardworking person eventually reaches a ceiling where time cannot be expanded any further. This is where financial knowledge becomes crucial. Because wealth building often relies less on effort and more on strategy. Understanding how money flows. Understanding how investments grow. Understanding how small decisions made today can create exponential outcomes years later. But without that knowledge, many people unknowingly remain trapped in a system that trades time for survival. And the longer someone remains inside that system, the harder it becomes to imagine alternatives. Because financial systems, like psychological ones, tend to reinforce themselves. People work to earn money. Money is spent to maintain life. And life becomes a cycle that repeats year after year, until retirement eventually arrives. But when someone begins to understand financial principles, something interesting happens. The entire structure of money begins to look different. Income is no longer the only goal. Ownership becomes important. Assets become important. Time becomes valuable in a completely new way. And slowly, a different financial path becomes visible. One where money can grow beyond the limits of hours worked. Which is why the financial knowledge gap remains one of the most powerful invisible barriers between stability and true wealth. Because once someone understands how the system works, they are no longer just participating in it. They are navigating it. 4. The comfort zone prison. Human beings crave safety. Not just physical safety, but psychological safety. We want stability, predictability, a sense that tomorrow will look similar to today. And this instinct once served an important purpose. For most of human history, survival depended on avoiding unnecessary risks. Exploring the unknown could mean danger. So the brain evolved to prefer what is familiar, what is predictable, what feels safe. But in the modern world, this ancient survival mechanism can quietly become one of the greatest barriers to progress. Because escaping poverty almost always requires doing something uncomfortable. Learning unfamiliar skills, taking financial risks, changing environments, pursuing opportunities that offer no guarantee of success. And the brain does not like uncertainty. When faced with unfamiliar paths, the mind activates a subtle defense system. A voice that whispers reasonable-sounding warnings. Be careful. Don't take unnecessary risks. What if it doesn't work? First, this voice seems helpful. Sounds like caution, responsibility, wisdom. But over time, something interesting happens. The brain begins to confuse familiarity with safety. Even if the familiar situation isn't ideal. Even if it keeps someone financially stuck. Psychologists call this tendency status quo bias, the natural human preference to keep things the same, even when change might lead to improvement. In other words, people often choose a known struggle over an unknown opportunity, because the known struggle feels predictable, and predictable feels safe. This is how the comfort zone quietly forms, not as a place of happiness, but as a place of familiarity. A job that feels stable even if it limits growth. A routine that feels safe even if it leads nowhere new. Habits that feel comfortable even if they prevent progress. Over time, the comfort zone expands like invisible walls around a person's life. Not built from physical barriers, but from psychological ones. Fear of failure, fear of embarrassment, fear of uncertainty. And these fears often grow stronger the longer someone stays inside the same routine. Because the brain begins to interpret unfamiliar paths as threats. Starting a business suddenly feels dangerous. Learning a new skill feels intimidating. Changing careers feels risky. So people postpone action. Maybe next year. Maybe when things are more stable. Maybe when I'm more prepared. But years pass. Opportunities move on. And the comfort zone becomes stronger, not because it offers growth, but because it offers predictability. And the paradox of the comfort zone is this. It protects people from short-term discomfort, while quietly limiting long-term progress. Because growth almost always exists on the other side of uncertainty. Every entrepreneur, investor, or creator eventually faces moments where the outcome is unclear. Moments where risk is unavoidable. Moments where the familiar path must be left behind. But those who remain trapped in the comfort zone rarely reach those moments. Not because they lack potential, but because the brain continuously steers them back toward safety. Back toward the predictable routine. Back toward the familiar life they already know. And slowly, year by year, the comfort zone transforms into something unexpected. Prison. Not one built by external forces, but one built by fear of the unknown. Yet understanding this psychological trap reveals something powerful. Because comfort zones are not permanent structures. They are mental boundaries, and mental boundaries can expand. Every time someone tries something new, takes a small risk, learns a new skill, or steps into unfamiliar territory, the brain slowly recalibrates what it considers normal. What once felt impossible begins to feel manageable. What once felt dangerous begins to feel like opportunity. And little by little, the walls of the comfort zone begin to move outward. which means escaping poverty is not always about a single dramatic leap. Sometimes it begins with a series of small steps outside the familiar. Because the moment someone begins stepping beyond the comfort zone, the prison walls start to disappear. 5. The identity trap. By now, we've explored several forces that quietly keep people trapped in poverty. Scarcity mindset, environment, financial knowledge, comfort zones. Each of these shapes behavior in powerful ways. But beneath all of them lies something even deeper, something far more difficult to change. Identity. Because human beings do not simply behave based on logic. We behave based on who we believe we are. Deep inside every person exists a story, a silent narrative about their place in the world, what they deserve, what they are capable of, and what kind of life belongs to them. This story forms slowly over time. It is shaped by childhood experiences, family beliefs, social expectations, past failures, repeated messages from the world around us. And once this identity takes root, the brain begins protecting it. Psychologists call this self-consistency bias, the powerful human tendency to act in ways that reinforce our existing identity, even when that identity limits our potential. For example, if someone unconsciously believes, "I'm bad with money," their brain begins filtering reality through that belief. They may avoid learning about finances, avoid investing, avoid opportunities that require financial responsibility, not because they lack the ability, but because success would contradict the identity they've accepted. And the mind naturally resists contradictions. In the same way, someone might believe, "People like me don't become wealthy," or "I'm just not the type of person who succeeds in business." These beliefs often feel like objective truth, but in reality they are stories. Stories repeated so often that they begin to feel permanent. And once identity locks into place, behavior begins aligning with it automatically. A person who sees themselves as disciplined will naturally act disciplined. A person who sees themselves as capable will pursue challenges. But someone who sees themselves as limited will unconsciously avoid situations that might prove otherwise. This is why identity is such a powerful psychological force, because it operates beneath conscious thought, quietly shaping decisions before logic even enters the conversation. And when identity becomes tied to struggle, escape becomes extremely difficult, not because opportunities don't exist, but because the mind quietly rejects paths that feel inconsistent with who someone believes they are. But here's the most important truth about identity. It is not fixed. It is not permanent. Identity is a story, and stories can be rewritten. History is full of people who grew up in poverty, surrounded by limitations, yet slowly began changing the way they saw themselves. They stopped asking, "Is this realistic for someone like me?" and started asking, "What would someone capable of success do in this situation?" That single shift begins to reshape behavior. New habits form, new risks are taken, new environments are explored, and gradually, a new identity begins to emerge. Not overnight, but step by step. Because identity does not change through belief alone. It changes through action. Every small decision sends a signal to the brain about who we are becoming. Every new skill learned, every risk taken, every moment of growth. These experiences slowly rewrite the internal story, until one day the person who once believed they were trapped begins to see themselves differently, not as someone defined by limitations, but as someone capable of building a different future. And that is the hidden truth behind escaping poverty. Money matters, opportunity matters, but the deepest transformation often happens internally. In the moment when someone stops identifying with the limitations they inherited and begins identifying with the possibilities they create. Because the moment identity changes, behavior changes, and when behavior changes, entire lives can move in a new direction, which means the most powerful escape from poverty doesn't begin with money. It begins with changing the story you believe about who you are. Escaping poverty is not just about money. It's about psychology, mindset, environment, knowledge, risk tolerance, and identity. The truth is, most people don't stay poor because they lack ability. They stay poor because invisible mental patterns shape the choices they make every day. Patterns created by scarcity, environment, education, fear, and belief. But once you understand these patterns, you gain something powerful: awareness. And awareness is the first step toward breaking any cycle. Because the moment you see the system clearly, you finally have the chance to step outside of it.